will ask much for being here. As it is our habit at the beginning of each year, we present the annual report of EFOR. I don't have to mention that this year we have a because it for this event with Editura Litera Publishing House, which is a translator of Anne Applebaum's books. You can buy some of them. Anne Applebaum. You can still buy books after the event if you didn't have the chance to do it before. What else do I have in the housekeeping section? Yes, the other part. University and literature, thank you very much. And of course, last but not least, the Central University Library where we are, and they graciously accepted to host us for this event. They very briefly that you have, you will also find a lot of options to support EFOR with donations in every form possible at the same QR code, so please scan it, don't forget. Will have to be in accommodate the ground floor and the first lobby. I'm not sure about the balcony, so I will ask you to yell if there are questions from above. We are broadcast live, right? Invite the director of BCU, Professor Mireia Doi, for a welcome on the stage. And then we will move with my colleague Otilia, a very
Thank you, dear author Anne Applebaum. Welcome to all of you, the aula of the Central University Library Karol I, an institution that bears the name of the in were meant to become pillars in the formation of an intellectual elite capable of building a modern, stable, and responsible society. And from this perspective, the library on democracy. It is a true honor for us to host today the presentation of the annual report produced by Expert Forum, dedicated to democracy and civil society. Of civil ideas are preserved and conversations are built that can shape the future. And for this reason, we are delighted to host today a dialogue between observers of contemporary political and Applebaum. Authoritarianism is constructed, perpetuated, and seeks to extend its influence. Through landmark works dedicated to the relationship between history is never a completely stable or neutral territory. It is constantly reinterpreted, reordered, and sometimes a world where that preserve documents, testimonies, and texts become all the more important. This is where the fundamental role of libraries emerges. Libraries do not establish an official contradictory. And in this sense, the library becomes a silent witness to the changing perspectives through which societies pass in an age when information circulates rapidly but much to our and democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Director. And now we will enter the substance. Shorten to react to them when we start the discussion. So yes, Otilia, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, Sorin. So, just to put things also look at over the past 30 years and how much the foreign support for civil society has mattered in order to make some recommendations for the future. We look Looking a little bit at the past to make sense of the present, we divided the history of democratization in Romania in 3 phases. In the first phase, which was the before accession phase, and to get revenge at the past. So we were very lucky that in the first decade and a half, there was a very strong gravitational pull to the West, and at the same this yourselves. You remember that the civil society emerged mostly as a reaction to the capture of political power by previous communist elites, and in Europe. Support from outside for civil society, and we looked at American support and we looked at European support. And something that is very important is to understand the fact that considered the governments as moving slowly towards democracy and becoming more and more open to integrating without any kind of bad feelings inputs from outside. This is very important, and I'll tell you why. At the same time, after 95, once we got a clear consensual agreement in society that we are going to move to EU and NATO, we started to have conditionality from outside. What happened was that once we graduated, everybody expected Romania to be a fully mature democratic country with all liberal institutions and constitutional relationships and rule of law and everything. And that meant that there was less conditionality, and except for the rule of law, which you know very well, the CVM, and there was also much lower support for civil society, which moved to countries in the region who were on the track to accession. But we still relied very much whenever it was about making any reform, it was still Brussels and Washington who were pushing it, and there was no buy-in from society, no real buy-in. So, for example, when there was a huge, clash between constitutional powers in 2012, it was mostly Brussels and Washington who pushed for the stabilization of the situation, and not so much the street or the civil society. So at the same time, the civil society organizations and media, which were shaping public space, they had a very limited success to somehow compensate for the lack of funding which was coming from outside. That means they had a really hard time in building a local constituency. And then we get to what happens today. So after 2014, once a lot of civil society had actually been hollowed out for various reasons, lack of resources, and maybe people moved to other places, working either in consultancy or moving to politics. You get the birth of a different civil society, which is more grassroots, more voluntaristic. For example, we saw the protests for Roșia Montană, for Collectiv, really organic, but at the same time a little bit different than the type of civil society grassroots that was the Alianța Civică in the 90s. And it turned out that it was equally easy to mobilize people for different types of values. So how do we say which civil society is good? Yes, if you can mobilize a big mob of people in a wrong direction, it can be actually very bad for your democracy. And civic mobilization by itself, without a clear set of values and without rational thinking behind it, can be actually a downside for democracy. So many divisions were accelerated by social media, and very importantly, we have now not only the Western model, which we had in the 90s, we also have the rise of alternative authoritarian regimes like China or Russia, which became very assertive, and they propose a different way of doing things. Not so much, democracy and rule of law and all that stuff that blocks an authoritarian from having his way. So what do we learn in terms of support for civil society? It's very important that external and for democratization in general, it's very important to understand that in our case, in Romania, external anchors worked very well. Whether it was by conditionality or by the initial support to civil society, which was very small. So don't imagine huge amounts of money. It was something like $2-3 million for 2-3 years in the first years of the 90s. But we also discovered that Romania, once we joined the West, became more and more aligned with the general trends. So we see at the same time backsliding to previous poor governance, but also a move with the trends in the rest of the world towards authoritarianism. And we had over-optimistic assumptions that democratization is one way and irreversible, that governments in the EU, once you join the EU, you meet the Copenhagen criteria, you are always going to be welcoming to all sorts of inputs and ideas and contrarian views from the society. We also saw that civic mobilization is very good in some cases, but can be equally bad if you have extremist groups, for example. And we also discovered that we kind of lost the control on our information space. And the free market doesn't work that way. So the assumption was that you have media, which is supported financially by readers, or by, advertising, and then you have an editorial policy which is completely separated and checked and vetted. But that doesn't work, and this is not how we get in our information nowadays. We have a broader form of getting our information from influencers, social media. We have media which is owned for benefits from spreading certain types of information and not necessarily for the information for the public good. And when I mean the information space, I mean also, let's say, not the media per se, but also policy briefs, watchdog activities, those types of things which bring analysis to the data that is available in the public space. So this is for the start of the discussion, and the question is, how do we better anchor democratic values in a society? And maybe even more fundamentally, do we really care about democracy, rule of law, institutions, human rights, checks and balances? Are we willing to fight for it? And that is a question also at the EU level. Yes, if we are willing to fight for it, it's maybe time to put our real efforts into this. And what is the sustainability of civil society? Is it better to expect it to somehow get its money from wherever, or is it better to give a continuous funding, provided that you check constantly the quality of the output? How do we get back control on and ensure integrity of our information space for informed citizenship? We want active citizens, but we want them to be informed. Yes, that's very important. And is it possible for the EU to find ways to combat the backsliding in EU member states? Or we rely that maybe we can tweak a little bit the decision making in the EU and just bypass the ones who backslide. Those are questions. I don't have answers for this. But we have a suggestion. One way in which we're thinking of building a little bit of primarily financial but also buy-in for the integrity of the information space. So we need to acknowledge the fact that good information shaping our public space should be considered as a service of general interest. That's the basic principle for which we have, for example, public broadcasting. But we need to think about this idea also in general when we talk about who shapes our information space. So it's very important, we talk about media literacy, for example, but how about people not having access to good quality media because it's behind the paywall, whereas all the disinformation is available for free. So that means we need to have access to high quality information for free, but at the same time, those who produce information really need to get paid for it, because otherwise, what would they do it? Yes? So we might consider a mix of private donations, public funds, and that should be in order to avoid becoming, like state media. We need to have a sort of intermediary organization which ensures an independent check. We need to have a joint space pan-European. So not only EU, but also Western Balkans and Eastern Partnership countries, because we are all facing the same major source of disinformation, let's put it that way. Yeah? We are thinking of a model in which you give competitive grants. So that means people apply. And for media, watchdogs, think tanks, and so on, which ensures also a competition of ideas, but also an independent check on the types of information that gets supported and the kind of information producers that get supported. But that means you need to have also a sort of panel of top credibility figures who can check who gets the money and for what, yes? And in short, and that you are going to find more details about in the report, it's basically taking the US experience in grant making and putting EU money into it, essentially. So I will stop here and we'll go to the...
Thank you very much, Otilia. And it is my pleasure now to invite on stage Anne Applebaum. Down from the professor's box where she was sitting, because for those of you who are as uneducated about this place as I am, that's a professor's box, and that's a royal box where nobody should sit, actually. We were very careful that none of you sits there unless you are royal blood, but nobody signed up as royal on our sign-up sheets, so this is where we are. Thank you very much, and I will start giving you a microphone. And let me start with this question. If you have a quick reaction or longer reaction to what we said, I think we should sit. Yeah. Or however you please, or especially if you want to disagree with something that Otilia said, or to add up, and then we will delve into into deeper questions about history of the region and trends. So please.
So first of all, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here in Romania. I have been here several times before, including for a week when Ceausescu was still in power. It was in 1989, but it was before the revolution. It was the spring or the summer. And so I have some very small idea of how far Romania has come and what extraordinary changes have taken place here, and actually how much you have achieved. I think that we, in Central Europe, as you all know, I lived part of the time in Poland. We don't, we get used very quickly to change, and we just assume that it's normal, and we don't spend enough time reflecting on really what great achievements have been made in this region. And we've had 30 years of peace and a rise in prosperity, and I see it here too. And I'm congratulate all of you for the work that you did to achieve that. As has already been discussed on this panel, we are in an era, though, now of really rapid, dramatic change. And it's not just in Romania, it's in the world. Let me say I spent some time recently trying to think of what is the right word to describe this moment, which actually I do feel is the equivalent of 1989. I feel we're in a moment of that kind of change. And I don't know, is it a rupture? Is it a transition? What's the right word? And actually the word that I came up with was the word swerve. And I took this from the title of a literary history. It was a book that was written by a Harvard professor about the Northern European Renaissance and how they rediscovered some old ancient documents and ancient texts and writing, and how that changed the nature of European thinking. And we are in a moment like that, where in the United States, but also elsewhere, we have a kind of rediscovery of some old ideas. And these are ideas from the 1920s and the 1930s. And these are ideas about how to do politics, the politics of friends and enemies and of political division. These are ideas about how a really strong leader defies the rule of law, breaks the law, rules in a state of emergency. These are some ideas about national sovereignty, but using the word sovereignty in a specific way to mean something that's exclusive and isolating, rather than empowering. I'm in favor of national sovereignty, but I think nations should look to their own interests, and very often their interests are in being connected to other nations. And you see the rediscovery of these ideas everywhere. Some of it comes from the US, some of it is European, some of it is Russian. And you also see now the very strong influence of autocratic thinking. It's not an accident. It comes from Russia, China, and the autocratic world, as I've written about in some of my books. And it is for people who are looking for a new, revolutionary, radical political project. Some of it is very exciting and seems new. As I said, it's in fact very old. It's the idea that liberal democracies are weak and degenerate. We heard this already from Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin, actually, in the 1920s and 1930s. This is not new. And that authoritarianism is strong and safe and dependable. Also, this is a very old idea. And so the rediscovery of these ideas is something that we see. And I would stress that these are not conservative ideas. The word conservative gets misused here. This is not about conservatism. It's not about social conservatism or anything else. This is a form of radicalism. And it has the potential to be very destructive. And I know that it's, it maybe feels particularly confusing here, but actually the fact that you see this, these trends happening here in Romania also reflects the fact that Romania is connected to Europe, and it's connected to America and to the world. And so these, this fashion for radicalism that is spreading in other places, I think it's pretty normal that you would have it here. I don't want to take time away from your questions, so I won't go on too much longer. I'll just say one other thing. I know that in Romania, I've gathered this from being here for a couple of days and speaking to a range of people, that there's a lot of concern about what the United States wants from Romania versus what the European Union wants from Romania. I don't think Romania should be forced to choose, and of course Romania should have a good relationship with America, and your president should have a good relationship with the American president. I don't object to that, but it's also really important that Romania always remembers where are your own security interests and your own national interests, and your national interests are obviously in remaining within a stable European Union, which offers you access to a big market and to and to the possibility of travel and commerce and interaction with the continent. And your interests also are in making sure that Ukraine wins the war with Russia, because the greatest security threat to Romania would come from some kind of Russian victory or some kind of incomplete, some kind of chaos or disorder in Ukraine. This would be dangerous to Romania for economic reasons, but also military and security reasons. And it's important to remember that is your priority, and it may not be the priority of the President of the United States. It might not be America's priority, but it's important that Romania remember that and stay connected to the other countries in Europe who also continue to believe that's their priority, and that's Poland, that's Germany, that's the Scandinavian countries, that's the UK, and others as well. So I'll stop there and wait for questions. Thank you very much.
No, but directly related to that, but broadening a little bit the perspective, for a number of years after '89, we all thought in the region that democracy would consolidate and spread and everything will go in the same direction. So what went wrong, really? And what was the biggest misconception that we had back in the, optimistic year in the 90s about the democracy in our region? And by our region, I mean the former communist countries. Some are member countries of the EU today, some are not, but we are in a way sharing experiences of communism.
So I think the misconception was this idea that democracy is somehow forever. That you get democracy and then that's it. You don't have to do anything anymore. That democracy is like tap water and it just comes out of the wall and you don't have to think about where the water comes from. And it's not really important for most people to be involved in it. Everybody can go and live their life and, make money or paint paintings or write books. And then some specialized people who are politicians over there, they can do democracy, and once every 4 years or 5 years, you show up and vote. And that turns out to be not correct. And actually, the deepest thinkers about democracy, if you go back to for example, the origins of American democracy in the 18th century, never believed that. And so when the people who wrote the American Constitution were debating it in Philadelphia in the 18th century, they assumed that there would be challenges to democracy. And there are even quotes from Alexander Hamilton, one of the American founders, who says, we know someday, a kind of demagogue will come along who will bewitch people, and we need to put checks and balances into the Constitution to protect against that. All of them were great readers of Roman history, and they were all obsessed not with the Roman Empire, but with the Roman Republic and how it fell and how it was challenged by Julius Caesar. And so all of that was very much in the background of anybody who's ever thought about democracy understands that it can decay from within and it can be overthrown. It's true that in the early 90s, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the movement towards democracy, which was not just in Europe, actually, it was all over the world. It was in South Africa, it was in Latin America, it was in many other places as well. It created this feeling of inevitability. I was just speaking yesterday with somebody. We were remembering Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History. And those of you who've actually read the book know that he didn't actually say that this is the end of history or that nothing else can happen and that everybody will now be liberal democratic from now on. But that's what people wanted to read. And that's what people wanted to hear. And it was also enormously comfortable for everybody, because if we have democracy and like that's done, then we can all do other things. You know, we can create companies and we can just think about money because politics aren't important. And I think that was that assumption of inevitability was the mistake. And the fact is that democracies require constant work, they require civic education, they require civic engagement, and not just in sort of online mobs, but in you know, in local politics, in running campaigns, in also in engaging. You know, democracies are, you know, societies change and they need constant reforms, and the Constitution that you wrote in the 18th century needs to be updated for the 21st century, but even in smaller time scales. And so I think that was that was one mistake. And I think one mistake that's maybe more specific to this region, and here it's not Romania, it's also Poland and the Czech Republic and other countries, was being too dependent on the idea of an outside model. You know, and while models are good in the beginning, you know, you want to think about how your constitution should be written, you want to think about how, you know, you look at what works in other places. I mean, this is completely legitimate, you know, that when you think about how to make your country better, you look at places that work. But the idea that somehow, you know, stability in Romania and, I don't know, civil society in Romania and politics in Romania is somehow dependent on support from or you know, a particular set of politics in Washington, you know, or even in Brussels. I mean, I think this is a mistake. You know, the desire to have a country that's well run and a country that's, you know, fundamentally democratic and in which there's some form of self-determination and the society has an impact on the state, that has to come fundamentally from within the country. And anything that depends too much on outsiders is always a risk, because as we've seen in the last few years, you know, the countries on the outside can make decisions that are not beneficial to Romania.
Yes, yeah. Coming closer to the subject of your books, specifically the last one, Autocracy Incorporated, the one in black cover here, which will be signed after this. You speak about an ecosystem of authoritarian powers, and we know, I don't have to name names, we know who they are, but my question is, in what sense are they different from what we had during the Cold War, where there were also blocs? Now, are they a bloc in the same sense that the communist bloc was, you know, an organic entity, or they are different? And in what way are they different?
No, so the modern autocratic network, the big difference is that it's not a network that's based on ideology. So if you look at communist China, nationalist Russia, theocratic Iran, countries like Zimbabwe, Venezuela, and, well, actually the Venezuelan regime, the Chavista regime, is still in place. You know, these are countries that have different aesthetics, different geography, different history. They don't have even necessarily a common leader. They have common, you know, they have some different interests. They aren't really an alliance. You know, they don't automatically defend one another. It looks like Russia and China, for example, right now are helping Iran, but we don't know the extent, and they seem to be doing it very, very subtly. And so you know, so their interest is rather, you know, they have a common interest in staying in power. All of the leaders or the ruling parties of this group of countries. They have a common interest in maintaining their form of society, and they do share some features. So all of these are either one man or one party or oligarchic states. They seek to rule without real opposition. They seek to dominate or control as much as possible the information space. They do not have independent courts or a legal system. They don't have rule of law. Instead, they have rule by law. And that means that the law is what the leader says it is at any given moment. So the law can change depending on what the person in power wants. And so that's very different from rule of law, which is when the legal system is is loyal to a constitution and to a set of principles rather than to a particular person. All of them, these are also all very secretive states. And they're also, and this is another big difference from the dictatorships of the 20th century, they are almost exclusively run by billionaires or by very rich people. So they are all they are interested in personal power and personal wealth, and they hide their wealth both from their societies, usually, and also from others. And so they are all very reliant on this system of shell companies, anonymous property ownership, tax havens. They can take money out of their own countries and they can park it in different parts of the world, and they all use the same systems for doing that. Sometimes the same lawyers and bank accounts. There have been a couple of revelations. One is called the Pandora Papers or the Panama Papers. These have all revealed that a host of autocrats from different countries, plus actually people from democratic countries, all keep their money in the same kinds of places, hidden from their own people and their own tax authorities. And that's an often overlooked but really important part of these regimes, because this is secret money that then gets funneled back into their own countries. It gets funneled into our countries, and it gets used in U.S. politics. There's it's called dark money funding. We sometimes don't know where it really comes from or who's paying for political ads and so on. And that I don't know the system in Romania. I imagine there's something like that here. Certainly, it exists in other European countries. And so they share this kind of system. And there is one other thing that they share, which is that all of them understand that the language of liberal democracy and the ideas of liberal democracy, so the belief in checks and balances, in the rule of law, in free speech, in rights, and in legitimate opposition, that all of those ideas, which are often very appealing and intuitively appealing to people who live in autocratic states. They don't have to have read Thomas Jefferson or Václav Havel to understand that it's unfair that the courts are biased in favor of the government. I mean, you can see it if you're an ordinary person. And so those ideas are very appealing. And so the autocratic states have spent, and some of their allies in the democratic world, have spent a lot of time and money and effort trying to destroy those ideas, both in their own countries, in their own opposition, because this is the language of usually their internal opposition, in Russia and China, very much so, and also in our countries. And so the Russians understood that they need to undermine the ideas and idealism of democracy everywhere. And so they support anti-democratic parties and movements, here, elsewhere, in the U.S., because they understand that if democracy is successful anywhere, it's a kind of criticism of them. I mean, in the case of Russia, there was very specifically, they understood that successful democracy in Ukraine, Putin understood this as an ideological threat to him. I mean, of course, he also understands that, he's a fantasy about the Russian Empire, and this is really a colonial war. But in addition to that, there's this element that, successful democracy in Ukraine could inspire Russians, because if Ukraine can be a democracy, then why can't Russia? And so that's also a really important piece of who they are. And so they cooperate. This is a group of countries who cooperate together opportunistically. They do it when it suits them. When it doesn't suit them, they don't cooperate. But they do have some institutions that they work for. There's the Shanghai Cooperation Council. There are other bodies and movements and international institutions they're trying to create that will allow them to work together. And another important point is that it's very tempting, to use the pattern of the past to describe the present. But actually, the Cold War is not a good model for what's happening now, because the Cold War, we had in our imagination there was a Berlin Wall, and there were, democracies on one side and dictatorships on the other side. This is actually not how the divisions in the world work now, because autocratic thinking and behavior can be found everywhere. It's on both sides of whatever division, and the divisions are not clear. And there are a lot of countries who have mixed systems, and there are a lot of democracies that have big and important autocratic movements or parties. And also there are democratic movements inside, inside the dictatorships. Actually, there has been one in Iran. There's a very powerful democracy movement in Iran that has organized huge national protests, has been repeatedly crushed. Many of its leaders have been killed or imprisoned or are now in exile. But the impulse in that direction has also always been there as well, and the same is true in Russia, and we saw the Hong Kong democracy movement in China. But the point is that there are no lines. There's no, you aren't safe because you're on one side of the wall. This argument between, about this is fundamentally about what kind of society we want to live in, and that argument takes place wherever you are.
Coming back to the democratic camp of today, why do you think intellectuals, or some of them, betrayed liberal democracy? In our countries, in the Western world, and when I say intellectuals, that's a bit of a stretch because it's a very East European concept, intelligentsia. It sits a bit oddly in the Anglo-Saxon context, but still, I mean, scholars, academics, media figures, in general, people who speak in the public domain without being necessarily public party members. Why did they turn against liberal values in the last 10, 15, 20 years, when at the beginning of their careers, they were liberal Democrats? And we don't have to point to examples. Is it Shakespearean ambition? Did they really change their values? Is it a hypocritical strategy? Is it quest for power? What is it? We see it all across the region, people who started being liberal Democrats and then they switch sides. What happens?
So I wrote a whole book about this.
Yes, your Twilight of Democracy.
And even though I wrote a whole book about it, I don't fully have an explanation. So in the book, I give different explanations and different examples of some people I know and some historical figures, from different moments in history. First of all, once again, this is not a new phenomenon. This is also something we know from the 1920s and 1930s. You know it from Romanian history.
There's a famous book, La Trahison des Clercs, by Julien Benda, a French philosopher, which was very popular in Romania in the 90s. For some reason, it was translated, everybody was quoting it. Exactly how intellectuals betrayed liberal values in the 20s.
Right. So this is not something that's new. And so I don't want to make generalizations. I think for some people, I think for almost everybody, sometimes there are opportunistic reasons, sometimes people see a way of making an alternative career, but I think also almost all of the people who I wrote about, and these were people who I think were sincere in their beliefs, almost all of them were people who were somehow disappointed. That somehow the liberal democracy that they'd created, whether in Eastern Europe after the fall of communism, or whether it was in the UK or the US, somehow it wasn't what they expected, or it wasn't what they were living up to, or they wanted something better, and they wanted and they very often imagined a kind of mystical past, so there was a form of nostalgia, and very often, including in the US, it's nostalgia for something that didn't exist. So the 1950s in America are remembered as this time of great peace and prosperity. They were also a time of, racial oppression and segregation. That was the moment of the beginning of the civil rights movement. And so you remember a kind of fake paradise that wasn't a paradise for everybody. And I see this phenomenon in many countries. When people are confronted, I think, by really constant change. We now live in a time of really, every day we see rapid changes, technological, demographic, social, economic. There's, I think a lot of people are maybe rightly worried now about what dramatic shifts AI is going to bring to a lot of professions and careers and people's lives. people become nostalgic for the stability of the past and some vision of, as I said, usually imaginary vision of something that came before. And that seems to, this disappointment with the present, inability to imagine the future, and reliance on some vision of the past. This seems to be the sort of unifying theme. And it gets a little bit different in every country and with every person.
Yeah, but still there's a puzzle, because we have been doing pretty well in Eastern Europe. You look at all figures, all the post-communist countries which became EU members. So why would they be unhappy? In Poland, in Hungary, in the Czech Republic, in Romania?
Poland is, the last 30 years are arguably the best 30 years in Polish history in about 4 centuries. I mean,
Romania too.
Romania too. I mean, you have to go back really a long way to find a time of more growth and more integration with Europe, and and so on. And so yes, I agree, but it wasn't the society some people imagined. They aren't playing the role they thought they would play. There are new elements, whether it's in the form of immigrants or in the form of foreign culture, or in the form of internet pornography, whatever is the new. There are new pieces of the political and social spectrum that they didn't imagine and they don't like. I mean, that's the best that I can do. And then you can look in very deeply into people's biographies, and then sometimes you get other answers.
Or maybe it can be because they were, some of them were literary or culturally figures, and even under oppression, they still had a status. In some is that, and literature was read as an alternative to politics or to public discussions which were suppressed,
that's what
and
I mean.
they lost that.
In that case, you have to look at, you'd have to look at somebody's specific biography.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were discussing until now commonalities, but how about differences between countries in our region, in Eastern Europe? So why still some are doing slightly better than others in terms of democracy and transitions? So why do some make a backsliding? So what can be the differential here? So why do we see what we see in Hungary, which was, the golden pupil of the 90s, one of them? And the obvious question, implication of this, can Russia ever be democratic?
Right, so that was like 3 questions.
Yes.
So one question is, why are there differences between countries? I mean, the answer partly is just because there are. I mean, the people have different histories. I mean, so one of the big differences, for example, the one that I can speak to the most easily is in Poland. So what was different about Poland in 1989? Poland had at that time already a kind of alternative elite. So there were not just a few activists or little intellectuals who were hounded by the secret police, but there were economists, there were sociologists, there were really people who had already been active in national politics, who were spokesmen for the Solidarity trade union. There were trade union activists. There were cultural activists. My husband's parents were, during the Solidarity movement, were I think my mother-in-law was the treasurer of the Solidarity unit in her office, which was a building planning commission. So the building planning commission had a kind of Solidarity unit, and so it was really very widespread, and it was in a lot of different parts of society, not just universities, not just students or a small group, and so when the change of regime became possible, basically because of events that happened in Russia, there was another kind of elite, or another political class, basically. Elite makes it sound like it was just rich people, but nobody was rich then, firstly. And also, it included people, sort of working class, activists and so on. So there was an alternative political class who could step in. And they made a lot of mistakes, and I'm not saying everything was great, and there were up and down years and so on, but it existed. There was already competition in the society, and I know that was not true here. And it wasn't true not because of any fault or national character of Romanians. It was true. It was because the nature of communism, especially in the last decade.
So the type of the communist regime, the nature of communist.
It was the nature of the regime. And as I said, I do remember, and even to me, so I lived in Poland in 1989. I was a very, very junior journalist. I was 25 in 1989. But even to me at that time, I was living in Poland, which was, had still not, I think by the time I came here, there hadn't been the election yet. It must have been before the June election. Even then, to me, Romania seemed very exotic. I mean, it seemed really very different from Poland. It was kind of radically different. And so, I think those kinds of historical accidents explain some of the change. I mean, I think, Viktor Orban, in some ways, is also a historical accident. I mean, I don't think there's anything inevitable about the decline of democracy in Hungary. It's just that, Orban is someone who had been prime minister, then he lost an election, then he won an election the second time with a very large majority, and he made the decision never to lose power again. And so then he began to alter Hungarian institutions, and he did it very, very slowly, actually, and mostly legally. I mean, he did it through, he had this constitutional majority and so on, but it's many of you will know that story. So he did it very slowly. It's the kind of boiling frog metaphor in English. You say, the frog is in the water and it doesn't notice it's being boiled. It doesn't hop out, until it's too late. And it was a little bit like that. It was actually not that different. I mean, just to give you an example, it wasn't that different. Maybe Venezuela is a bit more violent, but it was not that different from what happened in Venezuela. So this isn't necessarily, you don't have to be right wing in order to undermine your democratic institutions. You can also do it from the left. Historically, it's more often been from the left. I mean, a kind of left-wing language. I don't even know what left and right mean anymore. But he very systematically undermined the system. He created sources of funding for his party and for a small group of businesses close to the party that enabled him to stay in power. It's a very small country, and so on. I don't think there's anything about the Hungarian character or especially about Hungarian history that explains why this happened. I think it could happen. It could happen in a lot of places. I mean, size of the country matters. I mean, there was a version of this was tried also by the Law and Justice Party when they ran Poland for 8 years. And they failed for a variety of reasons. One, they didn't have as much support. There were Polish institutions resisted. There was some more active opposition from the European Union, I think partly because they did it in a much more dramatic and obviously illegal way. But all these things are also very contingent. I mean, I don't think any country is either guaranteed to be democratic because of its great, educated population or its values, nor do I think any country is guaranteed to be a dictatorship. And this is actually where we get to Russia. I don't think Russia, there's like a law of history that says Russia will always be an empire and it will always be a dictatorship. And there have been moments in Russian history where liberal movements have emerged. There have been attempts to change the nature of the system. I mean, actually in the 1990s, there were a lot of Russians who wanted Russia to be opened up and to have more contact with Europe and America because they also believed that this contact would liberalize Russia and Russian society. And the possibility for a different Russia always exists. Even a Russia that is maybe not a democracy, but is simply not imperialist and doesn't seek to conquer and destroy its neighbors. I mean, this would be a big advantage. And of course, it would be an advantage to the Russians. This horrific war has been unbelievably damaging to ordinary Russians. More than 1 million of whom have died or been critically injured. That's an enormous number of people, even for Russia. And it's damaged the economy. It's turned the economy away from the interests of consumers and towards the interests of the military and defense industries. It's been It's allowed Putin to increase the level of repression in Russia to the highest it's been probably since the 60s. Or I mean, Russia of the 1980s was actually more open than Russia is right now. So it's been a very, very damaging negative war for the Russians. And, maybe at some point, there will come along a Russian leader who recognizes this. We don't need this, the empire is destroying us. The empire is bad for us. And when you have that kind of recognition, maybe then you could get change. I'm not somebody who will exclude the possibility of there ever being change in Russia.
Yeah, you are absolutely right about Romania being an exotic case in the late 80s, even the early 90s. And I look in this room and I realize that many people are young enough to find it exotic if they could go back in time, even in the early 90s. And I realized its exotism in mid-90s when I went to Hungary, but in the other sense, actually. I realized I was coming from a strange place and I was shocked. And I remember, and the comparison with Poland is obvious, of Hungary, that they did have this, ferment of civil society.
Yeah, one other thing about Hungary that's interesting, I also remember Hungary in the early 90s seemed much richer than everybody else. And they were richer than Poland. There was sort of more stuff in the shops and so on. It's very interesting. This has now been gone into reverse. So Viktor Orban has impoverished Hungary in relative terms. I mean, it's not a terribly poor country, but in all of the rankings, Hungary falls behind. Hungary is, in all kinds of measurements, they are now at the bottom or close to the bottom of the European Union. Including behind Romania in a lot of statistics. And this is right. This you can ask a question later. I'm just telling you about the nature of the Hungarian economy, that it has fallen, relatively speaking, because of the Orban regime. So liberal democracy. I mean, this illiberal form of rule is sooner or later. Although of course it's always carried out and begun in the name of the people. We're doing this for the people. Almost invariably, if you think about it, it's logical. When you destroy the rule of law and when you make courts politicized. And when you get rid of independent institutions, it's very, very tempting for people in power to then cheat or steal, and inevitably you have the priorities of the government shift, and they're more in the interests of the people who run it and less in the interests of ordinary people. Yeah, no, the numbers and trends are clear, but that's not the point here. I was just remembering that they did have this alternative elite, as you called it, at the end of the 90s, the end of 80s, early 90s, the Gellert bourgeoisie, which was mostly in terms of intellectual power and not so much, physical reach. Probably in the same way that Poland, and it was shocking the contrast with Romania, and it's really a sad case what happened, that it was somehow lost. I mean, Viktor Orban is coming from these circles, but he completely changed power. So he's one of the examples of these turncoats, actually, in terms of values. And it's really sad because I love that country where I studied, actually. But coming back to Russia, the interesting question is, because you are also a Polish citizen and you study the region, you wrote this book, The Red Famine, for the first time published in Romania now, about Holodomor. Why the Ukrainian society is so different from the Russian society? So why Ukrainians are so different? We are very ignorant in Romania about the peoples who were part of the Soviet Union, and we discovered in the last few years that they are different in many ways. But why? I mean, it's really surprising for us. I mean, does it come from centuries ago? Is it something more recent? Is it really something real? Is it played up? Well, it's never made up. I mean, people feel what they feel. I mean, first of all, of course, Ukraine has a different history from Russia. I mean, Ukraine was part of, it's true that Ukraine didn't have its own state before 1990, but Ukraine had a role inside what was something called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth Before that, Ukraine had a prior history. Some of you will know the history of Kiev and Rus, which was the state that eventually gave birth to the Russian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian nations. But I mean, the Kiev and Rus was originally, it's where Ukraine is now. And so they have and whereas Muscovy developed differently, I won't go into all the details, but I mean, they have a different history, they have a different relationship to one another. But I think maybe the most important thing is that over the last century or so, the Ukrainians have had a very different attitude to power and to the state. And sometimes this serves them well, and sometimes it doesn't. And so what you will always see the Ukrainians have always been good at is kind of grassroots organizations. Organizing. There's a historic, certainly going back to Stalinism, but maybe before that, there's a historic suspicion of the state. That whoever, because the state is not ours. The state is run by the Russians. It's run by the communists. It's run by somebody else. And in the case of Ukraine, it was often communists from Moscow or Moscow-linked communists. So it's not our state. And so, everything that we do, we have to sort of self-organize. And so there is this deep tradition of grassroots organization. And you find it, you now find it, for example, in the way the military works. So the Ukrainian military is not entirely hierarchical. So it doesn't work exactly the way that other militaries work. So there's there's a general, and then under him, majors and colonels and lieutenants and so on, and they all answer, up the pyramid. Actually, there are also some pieces of the Ukrainian military that almost have their own way of running things. They're kind of semi-independent military leaders. I mean, it has a little bit, sometimes, the flavor of a partisan movement, that in particular areas, in particular parts of the country, there are different units that are run a little bit differently. Sometimes they have their own funding. I mean, obviously everybody works according to one strategy, and there is a central distribution of weapons and so on. But there is there are things inside the military that don't look like other places, and I think that's a reflection of Ukrainian society. And at this point, in the war, it serves them very well. It's one of the sources of their strength. That, for example, it turned out there were all these Ukrainian tech guys, some of them were in Kiev, some of them were in Silicon Valley, some of them were elsewhere, who came back and turned the Ukrainian tech industry towards both cyber defense and towards creating the world's most modern and sophisticated drone industry. One that's so modern and sophisticated that the Gulf states have asked for Ukrainian help this week. And there are now apparently 3 teams of Ukrainian drone experts, because it's not just the physical drones, which they also make in Ukraine now, but it's also the system that you use to run it, the software, the organization, and so on. And this, I think it does reflect something pretty deep about how the country works, and it explains some of their resilience. I mean, they also had a very strong tradition of local democracy, and so, for example, this I know because of some work I did on it, when the Russians came into territories of Ukraine that they occupied, they were very surprised to discover that there were these local mayors who had real legitimacy, and people listened to them. Because in much of Russia, the local mayor would just be someone appointed from, the regional capital, or from Moscow. But in Ukraine, they're elected, they were people with some local status, usually. I mean, I'm sure there were some bad ones too, but very often the mayor would have this power that surprised the Russian occupying forces, because they weren't used to that. They didn't think of people having decided who their local leaders were. And that's another very important difference. I mean, the thing that's always worrying about Ukraine is, when the war ends and we get to the reconstruction of Ukraine, does this grassroots organization and the suspicious of the state, will that serve them? It's made it harder for them to create a stable and well-run state, and that's been true also true for the last 30 years. So the same quality that's useful also has some downsides, and so but all of that, I think that history makes them very different from Russia, and of course the history of the last 30 years is different, and Ukraine has had, I mean, I wouldn't describe it as kind of pristine Swiss, I don't know, Jeffersonian democracy, but they've had a change of power. The voting matters. It matters who, the people campaign for real. People have some sense of having ordinary people, of having some influence on politics because they can vote. And as I said, especially some of these local elections are different. And in Russia, people just don't have that feeling because the vote, there's been only one candidate on the list, or there was only one real candidate and the rest were false candidates. And there's a lot of evidence of actual vote stealing, on top of that. And so, the Ukrainians have this sense of agency and of having their own power that the Russians don't have. And that's been true since 1990, which was now a pretty long time ago. And that is that's a big difference between the two countries. I mean, increasingly what will matter more, and this is true here as it's true in Ukraine and Russia, is that like us, this generation of people who even remember communism will disappear, and this era of whatever we're calling it, post-communist, Europe will be the thing, this era of transition, this era of democracy, whatever you want to call it, it's different in different places. This will be the thing that people remember and that will shape younger people. This is how people are growing up. And this memory of the last 30 years in Russia and Ukraine is quite different.
There's a sensitive issue here, but I still have to raise it, the relations with Ukraine. In Romania, there's been this wave of enthusiasm, mostly in the population, immediately after the escalation of the conflict in 22, and the state and the institutions have played in the right team, we help Ukraine, but there's a feeling of uneasiness all along this, and we sort of know that in quarters, especially in the military security apparatus, in foreign affairs, we are a bit uneasy about the relations with Ukraine, a bit of distrust. I mean, we can see it. And I was wondering how Poland has overcome the historical traumas, which are much more severe than what we have. We didn't have much to do with Ukraine actually before, but Poland, yes, there were, bloodshed, terrible historical experience. So how come that Poland is more openly supportive and honestly supportive while we seem to be in two minds in Romania?
So I can't speak about Romania in that sense because
Poland.
You would tell me. I mean, in Poland, it is also a little nuanced. Although, I think when the war first began in 2022, it was an enormous, spontaneous movement to support Ukrainians. And I think this just came from looking at, it was honestly the photographs from Ukraine looked to everybody like Poland in 1939. It just looked the same. There was sort of people, women and children at train stations, and there was, tanks in the streets, and there was almost like a kind of national trauma in Poland. It just reminded everybody of Poland's own war experience. And there was this enormous outpouring, and there were a lot of ordinary people who drove to the border to pick up Ukrainian refugees and take them to their houses. I think everybody I knew, or many, many people I knew, anybody who had any space had refugees in their houses for a while. We did actually. We have a country house. At one point, there were 9 people there. They were mostly kids, but there was a spontaneous and genuine, apolitical, I would say, not right-wing and not left-wing kind of outpouring of support. I know this happened in many other countries as well, but it was just because it reminded everybody of Polish experience, and there was this instant sympathy. Since then it's become, there are issues about Ukrainian grain being sold in Poland, and there was some arguments about Ukrainian truck drivers. There begun to be kind of some economic arguments. There is also in Poland, as there is everywhere, there's this presence of enormous online Russian and pro-Russian propaganda, which seeks to push very much these memory of historic conflicts, which now are 80, 90 years ago. But you can if you want to remind people that Poland and Ukraine didn't always get along, and they had difficulties in their history, you can do it. And there are people who are either for financial reasons or for political reasons are seeking to use this politics of division to advance their causes. And so you do see that also in Poland. I mean, it's not invisible. And there, you know, again, there are people who try to use this for, you know, to do politics. I mean, you know, nowadays, again, this is another old idea from the 1920s that's come back. I mean, there are, you know, everybody's looking for how do we create an enemy? How do we organize people and, you know, divide them in such a way that we've identified an enemy? And, you know, we try refugees, and that works for a while, and then it stops working because actually there aren't any refugees in Poland. I mean, you know, then we try LGBT people, you know, and that works for a while, but also not. Maybe Ukrainians, they could be the enemy, and there is always an attempt to find somebody who, you know, people need an explanation for why whatever it is in their lives isn't good, or why the society isn't perfect, and this constant search for an enemy, you know, occasionally lands on the Ukrainians. So it's not perfect. I mean, I should say there was in Poland over the last couple of decades, there were a number of historical commissions. There were attempts to write joint history books. There were, you know, attempts to, you know, reconcile Polish and Polish and Ukrainian historical memory. You know, there have been a lot of projects like that as well, and some of them are civil kind of grassroots projects. Some of them are academic university projects, and those have mattered too. But I still think the fundamentally it was this sympathy when the war started, because people just identified with the experience.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about coming back to the information space. And you said that most of these autocrats or dictators wannabe, they don't share a common ideology. But still, how many of these win democratic elections in democratic countries? This is how they come to power. And what stories do they sell? Is it something which is coherent, or is it are they pushing only against creating as much confusion and creating focusing on the divisions that exist in society? So is it converging towards a more coherent ideology in time, or is it just based on frustrations of people?
So are you talking about the consolidated autocracies, Russia and China, or are you talking about Hungary and Turkey? And I didn't fully understand the question.
The newer ones. Let's put it this way: the autocrats which win elections in new member states.
No, I mean, people win elections, you know, for a lot of reasons. But you know, to be clear, like Viktor Orban won a democratic election the first time, and actually the second time he was elected. You know, Erdogan won a democratic election. You know, these are all leaders who were made possible by democratic systems. And I don't want to be too overgeneral. There are differences between different countries, but it is true that there is a kind of, we call it populist, although I don't really like that word. You know, there is a kind of populist narrative that for a lot of people has been successful, and this is the narrative of, you know, and this is also, by the way, when you hear this kind of language, you know that you're listening to something that's dangerous and anti-democratic, and it's a narrative of I speak for the real people, not the elites, the foreigners, the intellectuals. You know, I speak for the real Hungarians, you know, or whatever, or the real Americans, and I represent the real people, as opposed to, and my opponents are traitors, are aligned with foreign powers. You know, they are not real, whatever, Hungarians or Americans or they're not really part of our country. This is Chavez's language as well, you know, in Venezuela. So it's, you know, I speak for the real Venezuela, not these foreigners. And this can have either a kind of right-wing flavor or a left-wing flavor. But it means the same thing. And of course, what is the implication of that? If you represent the real people and your opponents are traitors, then when you take power, you have to do everything you can to make sure they never win again. because we can't have the traitors running the country. And so so when you hear that kind of language coming from, in a democratic system where, where there are different parties competing and all of the parties are democratic parties and they all speak for different constituencies in the population, and yet you hear one party disqualifying all the others, then you worry, because that kind of language implies that that this leader or this party deserves to rule no matter what, because they represent the real people. And never mind that, I don't know, are intellectuals not real people? Are people who are in the opposite political party not real? Or they're not real Americans? But that's, I mean, it was one of the things, for example, that disturbed me about Donald Trump's election campaign in 2024, was the fact that it was the kind of language he used about the Democrats. He talked about them as vermin. He talked about immigrants as vermin, I think, but he used, Kamala Harris is a Marxist. She's a, radical. He used the language of, he compared them, his opponents to vermin, to insects, to people who were on the outside of America. And that's a kind of language that we actually had not had in U.S. politics before. I went back and looked up. There was an election campaign by a segregationist politician, in the more distant past. But George Wallace was a presidential candidate who ran on a segregationist platform. So it was an openly racist candidate who we had in the past. And I looked at his public speeches, and I didn't hear him using that language. So it's actually something that we haven't had, even in the, even when we had some ugly political candidates before, and we've had plenty of them. And this is a very, this is a very typical. It's very specific, and it's a language you can hear it from almost anybody who seeks to take a democracy and make it illiberal or make it into a more autocratic state. The first thing they have to do is disqualify and, even as I say, dehumanize their opponents, because the opponents have to be seen as illegitimate. Not just that they're wrong and I disagree with them and they want high taxes and I want low taxes. That's normal in politics, but they don't exist. They have no right to win.
I know that you are also concerned about the situation with the media, with mass media, and this is the last question I'm raising now, and then we will open up the dialogue with the room. But this is important because we've seen mutations, especially in the last, 10, 15 years, and it's been the global economic crisis eroding the basis of media, local newspapers disappearing, and then you had the Internet 2.0, which were social networks, and now we have Internet 3.0, which is artificial intelligence. So is it possible to continue to have democracy if we don't have a common space of reality which is shared and some space for debate and everybody's in a bubble, in their own subjective bubble?
It's a good question. I don't really have a good answer. I would diagnose the problem in exactly the same way. Functional democracy does depend on, we don't have to all share opinions, but we have to agree on what happened yesterday. We have to agree on what is reality. If you're going to make a decision about your national health care system, or should you build the highway in the north of the country or in the south of the country, then you need to base that decision on real information. And if you don't have any real information or any information that people trust, then you have a very hard time having a civilized or any kind of debate, even an uncivilized debate about it. And so the lack of, it's not just actually news media, but it can be, it's the doubt of, it's sometimes attacks on universities. In the US, we now have this really extraordinary attack on science and on the medical establishment, which is something we've never had at this scale and this level before, and is also even pretty unusual in the autocratic world. You don't see the Chinese attacking their scientific establishment. But you have, and all of those things, and attacks on expertise of all kinds, in the government expertise, outside of the government, and all of that will make taking rational decisions more difficult. I mean, if you can't make a good decision about something if you don't understand the reality of what it is. I mean, and so I mean, there's some hope in, that. Well, let me add one other thing, which is that this is a problem that could. They know what's available on the internet, and they put it together in various ways, and of course they make mistakes. And there's a danger that because how does information get from the physical world onto the internet? Well, it does it through journalism. Somebody goes out and sees something and describes it and reports it, and then it's on the internet. Or they do a scientific experiment and they learn about the property of some chemical, and then they put that on the internet. But someone has to do this job of finding and naming and describing reality, and they have to do it in a way that is, that is part of a friend of mine calls it the constitution of knowledge, in which there's in science, a system of peer reviews and some way of checking information and correcting it if it's wrong. And if you don't have any of those things, then this information that finds its way onto the internet will also be wrong. And then you'll have the phenomenon of people asking chatbots for, about reality and getting a completely distorted vision. So there is the possibility of this getting worse. It's actually my hope that, there are a lot of institutions in our societies that need real information, including business. If you're a company and you have to make a decision about, do you invest in country X or country Y, or do you buy, silver or copper, whatever. I mean, you have to base that decision on real information. And so companies maybe are going to work out at some point that they need reliable newspapers. They need reliable scientific institutions, so they need it, governments need it, a lot of different parts of the society need it, and I'm hoping that people will begin to rethink how we fund information. Clearly the model of the newspaper as it existed until a decade or two ago doesn't work anymore. Whether we look at, so I work for a magazine that now functions almost entirely in a subscription model. And maybe that's the answer. Maybe for other, maybe there will be a philanthropic answer. Maybe there will be, groups of businesses who work together to support certain kinds of information. I mean, it's probably not an accident that in the English language, the two of there's sort of 3 or 4 remaining really good newspapers, and one of them is the Financial Times and one of them is the Wall Street Journal. And that's because they speak to a community that needs good information and will pay for it. And so I don't know, we're still at a stage of looking for what the next models will be, but I agree that this is a crisis for everybody.
So as I say, everybody is entitled to their own opinion, but not to their own facts. So increasingly the struggle will be for reality and for facts, actually, and not so much about political opinions. Now we have to make good of our promise to open up the dialogue with the room. And I suggest that we take, this is what we will do. I'm not suggesting it. We will take batches of 3 questions. I already see 3 hands here. 1, 2, 3. We have 2 mobile microphones. Please, questions, not comments, and keep them short. And probably you should introduce yourself, but very brief, just name and affiliation.
Hello, so thank you for this very rich discussion. Emanuela Ignatoiu. I'm a lecturer at the University of Bucharest. So I have very short 2 questions. One, you mentioned Greenblatt's very good book, The Swerve. And my question is, so I do agree that there is this rupture and new a change, a drastic change. Do you see, I know it's early, but do you see towards which world we are heading, the new world. And the second question, many of us are very worried for the US because we see lots of signs of authoritarianism. And I do think that because of the wonderful check and balances and the democratic tradition and institutions that serve the US for so many hundreds of years, there is a sort of unawareness or sort of opaqueness to what's happening to most of the people. And my question is, whether there is more awareness now that the democratic system might actually filter healthy and very needed antibodies for what's happening now in the US. Thank you. Just to rephrase it. So I was trying to say that...
If you can keep it very short in 2 words,
very
the question.
So it seems that the democratic system that worked for many years in the US is sort of obscuring people to see what is happening, that there are the dangers to the...
People understand what's happening.
Yes, and also they rely so much on the democratic constitution, that they don't find new instruments to fight what is happening.
Okay, let's deal with this, and then I will really take 3 questions at a time.
Okay, I mean, first of all, your question about what world we're going to, I don't know. There are many good possibilities and there are negative possibilities, and it all depends on... It depends what happens, which is not a very good answer. I didn't fully understand your question. I mean, was it about, I think it was about the democratic institutions in the US. I mean, if you're asking whether people understand now why they're important or, understand that some of them are failing, and then yes, they do. And there is a reaction inside the US. There are, in particular, the court system and has begun to react. There were some decisions taken at the beginning of the Trump administration that seemed to violate the law, that seemed to defy the will of Congress. Some of that is being reversed. Unfortunately, it takes time for these things to work through the court system. We saw, really the most important decision, in recent months was the Supreme Court's decision about tariffs, saying that the president doesn't have the ability to whimsically apply or unapply tariffs depending on whether he likes a particular leader or he doesn't like the leader. And that was a really important statement of reminding people that actually in the American system, Congress makes decisions about taxation, and tariffs are a form of tax, and Congress makes decisions about money and budgets. And so that mattered a lot. One of the other things that's important about checks and balances is that really the people who are inside the institutions have to want them to work in order for them to work. And we have seen in the last year that this Republican-led Congress doesn't always want to exercise Congress's power. So Congress has the power to stop the president in almost anything to do with money, and actually anything to do with war. And the Congress is able to stop or block the president. It's true that Congress has grown weaker in the last years for a lot of reasons that could discuss later at some point. But if Congress wanted to reassert its power and wanted to exercise its control, it could do so. Actually, in the Supreme Court decision about tariffs, one of the judges who, in writing the opinion, made exactly this point. That many decisions are made better by Congress than by the president. Congress represents a very wide range of Americans, geographically wide, different parts of the country, big cities, rural areas, people of different political views, although that's not even as important as this geographic range. And so it's more appropriate for Congress to make a lot of decisions than the president, who's, after all, at the end of the day, only one person. And if you read the U.S. Constitution, you can find that there. And so, maybe Congress will rediscover it in the coming months.
Yes, thank you. So we have about 30, 40 minutes for questions, so don't rush. But I will stick to this rule to take more than one question at once. Christina and the gentleman next to her.
I'm going to write down the question.
Yes, please. Yes,
Thank you very much. I'm Christina Buzaș. I'm Principal Manager with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development working on civil society relations. Thank you so much for this insightful discussion. So you mentioned about people's nostalgia for the past, the so-called stability of the past, and we see a faltering sort of support for democratic values, for democracy. Even in Romania, we see nostalgia for communism, which factually was much worse for people. Now we're doing much, much better, both economically and from many points of view. So given this faltering support of people for democracy and democratic values, which is required for democracy's survival, what do you see in terms of the future of democracy worldwide, let's say, or and also given the current context of the challenges on the U.S. Democracy, it's a sort of ambivalent take on the war in Ukraine and also the war in the Middle East. Thank you.
And the next one, please.
Hello, I am Dragoș Drăgușin. I'm a serial entrepreneur. I would put things in like a little bit dichotomical, but it's easier to understand. We speak about democracy and autocracy. If we speak about democracy as a purpose, as a scope, we speak about checks and balances and rule of law like as tools. And democracy is, as a purpose, menaced for a time being by these tendencies of autocracies. If we discuss about tools that sustain autocracies, we see AI, which is not designed for this, which would be very useful for the society. I mean, is the most important discovery of the world in the history.
Can we get closer to the question?
Sure. But I want just to explain in order to put all the things in rule. But we have had the opportunity to see this during the last elections in Romania in 2024. So if we discuss like this, we understand that using tools, we can destroy democracies easier than during the propaganda of Goebbels or during the propaganda of communist regimes. So I would propose to introduce a notion of qualifying democracy, qualified democracy.
I have to stop you here, unless you have a question.
I have a question.
Please,
what
raise the question.
What do you think about qualifying democracy?
Exactly. That's good. That's a good question. That's a good question. Let's answer.
I'm not sure. So there was one question about the future of democracy. I mean, the future of democracy depends on what we do today. I mean, in other words, there's no inevitability about the decline of democracy, and also there's no inevitability about the survival of democracy. Democracy will succeed or fail tomorrow, depending on what we do today. There's no law of history that sends us in one direction or another. It's people's actions that determine what happens. I understood the question about, the second question was about, of course there are many different forms of democracy, and there's no rule that says the exact version that we have in country X or Y is the perfect version. You can, we have presidential systems, we have parliamentary systems, we have constitutional monarchies, we have, there are different versions of it, and there's also no law that says that you can't change the way yours works if it doesn't work. I was just speaking last night at dinner to a friend and was feeling sad that more countries don't have this very useful system of constitutional monarchy. So you don't have to have a presidential election, you just have a king, and he has no power, or she, queen, who has no power, and they look nice in pictures and they greet foreigners and they fulfill this function of connecting the nation to the past, but they don't intervene in politics. And so, all I'm saying is that there's no, you can also reform your political system if it needs to be reformed. And maybe after, certainly I know that in Poland, it's very hard to do now. But for various reasons, Polish democracy is also flawed. The way the system works doesn't make sense. There's an elected president who has huge popular mandate because he's won a national election, but who actually has very little power. And this is, every single president from every single political party arrives there pleased that they've won this huge election, then discovers they can't do anything. And so there's always competition between the president and the prime minister. So this is just one example from another system. So you can always reform and change the system, and there's no reason why you should be stopped from doing that.
There's one question here, the second here, either the third one, please, the third one. Yes, I will come.
Thank you very much, Laura Stefan, Executive Director of Expert Forum. We see more and more these days an extrapolation of extremes, both in politics and in public discourse. My question to you is, how do we rebuild the space for debate in the middle? Because many people feel disenchanted both with politics but also with public debate because they feel they are pushed to the side. And I don't want to use left and right because, as you said, I don't think this is very relevant anymore.
Okay, the second one. Can we get the second microphone? Here.
Good afternoon, Anca Gradinaro. I'm a journalist. My question is, do you think that it's efficient to fight against propaganda with democratic rules? And if I am allowed, I would ask you an advice. The Romanian diaspora, I think it's the biggest in Europe. What would be your advice for the Romanian parents in the context that a lot of young people, they are still trying to study abroad of Romania? Thank you.
Okay, and the gentleman behind you.
Hello. My question is, in this clash between democracy and autocracy, where fits the democratic states, democratic institution, European institutions? What is the role of protecting and defending democracy? I mean, this institutional setting.
Thank you. Let's take them one by one or combine them.
I mean, how in a world of extremes, how can the majority actually? I mean, most countries, the majority is not extreme. The word centrist sounds boring. So, I mean, I've heard people use this expression radical centrism to make it sound more exciting. But, most people want, a well-run society and they dislike extremes of the right and the left. I mean, part of the answer is for the people who believe that to begin also expressing their views and also learning how to use social media. And here, it's a problem. So the way that there are different forms of social media, but the most important ones, the way the algorithms work is they do favor emotion, anger, division, and in one or two cases, I mean, I think on the X algorithm, actually the far right is promoted, by the way the system works. So how do you compete with that? In an ideal world, we wouldn't have this problem, but we do have it. And so living in the real world with the real media system that we have and with the reality that many young people now increasingly get all of their news from social media. So everything they know about the world comes from TikTok or Facebook or one of the other social media apps. It means that people who want to communicate with those people need to use them. And I know there's a reluctance, especially among older people and people who are used to academic speech and, the world of, high-end journalism are not used to doing this. But and maybe everybody isn't going to be able to do it, but some people have to try. And so I would say increasingly thinking about how to reach the parts of the population that just don't read newspapers and aren't going to read, this fantastic report, which I don't think I've complimented enough, actually. The report that that they've written is, it's a really comprehensive, excellent history of post-communist Romania. Really every Romanian should read it, but they won't. And so, how do we transmit the ideas that are in that report to people in a simpler form? And I leave that to you as your task for the next couple months. But so that's what I think. Actually, the question about how to reach the Romanian diaspora is very similar. To reach them, you have to try to reach them. So you have to, target them with messaging, or, campaign, or have politicians go and meet with them in wherever they are, in Italy or in Spain. I don't know where most of the Romanian diaspora is. And have answers for them, and listen to what they have to say, and what would they like, okay, they don't live inside Romania, but what would they like from the Romanian state, and how could the Romanian state somehow support them? And so speaking to them, even speaking to them about the EU and how it works, and why their current circumstances also depend on a strong European Union, it would be also a useful message. So finding them and reaching them with messaging. But if you don't do that, then they won't hear it, And so there's a lot of I hear this almost there's a lot of complaining about this group or that group, who we can't reach them. Well, you have to find a way to reach them, and that's the job of people who care about the political system. European institutions is a really interesting question. European institutions are also the product of democracy. The European Parliament, obviously, but even Europe is, there are a lot of myths about Europe, and one of them is that Europe is run by bureaucrats. This is actually not true. There is no decision that is taken by the European Union that hasn't been signed off on by actual politicians. So the Council of Ministers, the most important body in Europe is the body of the prime ministers, and then for each segment of, the body of the finance ministers and the body of the defense ministers also make decisions. So it's actually the politicians of Europe are in charge of the European Union. And actually, most of the faults of the European Union, like when it screws up and does things badly, that's usually the fault of the politicians too. When there's why doesn't Europe have a more coherent foreign policy and one voice? Well, guess why? It's because there are politicians who don't want it to have that voice. And so understanding that Europe is also fundamentally democratic is really important, and it's important to explain to people, because it is true that it's farther away, it's one level up, it's more distant, and it's very useful for domestic politicians to remind people of that. And of course, there's also, this temptation also always to say, when Europe does something good, then the local politicians take credit for it, and when something bad happens, then you blame Europe. So it's very easy. It's very easy to do that. It is also true that because it's in the bloc's interest. At the very least, it's in the bloc's interest to have rule of law everywhere, because the single market cannot function if if one country has a politicized court system, because then you can't have, if you have a contractual dispute between, a Dutch company and a local company, then you can't rely on the courts to resolve it. So actually, the preservation of the rule of law is in some ways almost even more fundamental to the EU than democracy itself. Like, that's actually the thing that makes the single market work. That's what makes integration work, is that everybody respects the law, or tries to the best of their intent. So the EU has a real interest in preserving the rule of law. And actually, in Poland over the last decade, we did see important EU interventions in when you had an attempt to politicize the Polish court system and undermine its independence. There was a kind of EU intervention that turned out to be actually quite useful and successful. And so I'm in favor of there being, because it's in the bloc's interest and because it's in the interest of other countries, I'm in favor of the EU taking a stance on helping out whatever, their different formula and their different different ways of imagining it, of encouraging the practices that lead to the rule of law in member states, because it's not just beneficial for that member state, it's beneficial for all the member states. And so there's a kind of general interest in that. I mean, it's very important to remember that the EU was never set up, contrary actually to what the sort of anti-EU lobbies say, it was never set up to intervene in the politics of member states. It just doesn't have the tools to do that. And it can't do that, and it's always been reluctant to do that. And the only thing that it can do, as I said, is express an interest in certain kinds of institutions. I mean, it can't root for one leader over another. It can't block somebody from, it just can't do that. It doesn't do it. But it can say, we need courts to live up to a certain standard, because if we don't have that, then the single market doesn't work. So that's, I think in that sense, the EU, it maybe needs to become a little bit more self-aware of how important that role is, and it needs to get better. It's kind of fatally bad at communication for reasons that I don't really understand. Maybe that's because that may also be the fault of national politicians who don't want it to communicate too well. But having it play that role, I think, is very useful.
There was a hand raised over there, the lady over there, the gentleman over here, and another one here, and we'll go for another round. Please. Doamna din spate.
Hi, my name is Eliza. I work for the National Television. I'm a journalist. So in the book Twilight of Democracy, written in 2020, you express concern that social networks will divide people and intensify polarization until violence becomes the only way to determine who will lead. My question is...
Can you speak a little bit louder? More clear? We cannot hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, clearly.
Should I say... Okay, so I was saying that in your book, Twilight of Democracy, you express concern that social media networks will divide people and intensify polarization until violence becomes the only way to determine who will lead. Basically, what happened in December 2025 in Romania, the presidential...
Slower.
Am I talking too quickly?
We can hear you. We will not answer it.
In December 2025, in Romania, the presidential elections were called off precisely because the results were compromised through platforms such as TikTok, which you spoke about earlier. What is your opinion about that? And how do you see the threat that social media platforms pose to democracy? And the last thing I would be interested if you could answer is what measures should be taken? Is banning children from social platforms one of the options to set a certain age?
That's a good one, about the cancelled elections. The gentleman over here, and then over here.
I'm Cristian Ducu. I'm a former Wilson Center fellow, and I want to ask you something related to civil society, because I witnessed when Wilson Center was shut down. And I want to ask you, what can we learn from the situation in the US, particularly with the all these organizations, non-profit and others, that rejoice or undermine the other part of the civil society, who try to put down everything that's anti-Trumpian or everything that is bipartisan in DC. And I'm talking now about Wilson Center, about Institute of Peace, and on the other side, Heritage Foundation, all the other. So this situation in DC.
Yeah, thank you. Over here, the gentleman over here.
Hello. So I'm Alexandru Gheorghe. I am a lawyer, an entrepreneur, and I study ethics in the philosophy faculty. My question, I've heard someone funny saying something that Elon Musk has so much money that he cannot spend it on Earth, and he plays with the money, spending it in space. So my question is about what do you feel about the elites you were referring to earlier, saying that there is an idea that the elites are playing with their money, destroying the world. And if the test fails, they have an exit. They can easily go to their bunkers, the luxury bunkers. And my question was whether you feel this is what they are doing, or they are doing what are they doing with their money?
Or is it just our impression?
Or is just our impression?
Thank you.
Yes, thank
we
you.
can move to it. Let's take them one by one.
Okay.
About cancelled Romanian.
So, obviously, the Romanian state sets the rules for how elections work. And if someone has violated the election rule and they have spent money that they didn't declare, then the Romanian state is within its rights to cancel the election. And that's a decision of the Romanians, and I wouldn't want to be involved. I mean, there is a requirement, though, if you're going to cancel an election, that you offer the public a full explanation of why. And in order to maintain some trust and faith in the voting system and in the electoral system, there needs to be a lot of transparency and explaining why and exactly what happened. As I understand it, and I really didn't want to. I asked not to comment on Romanian politics because I've only been here for a couple of days and I'm not an expert. But as I understand, there's a lot of concern that there was no transparency around the decision. And so offering people more information, I would say would be is very important. The second question I've written down, what do we learn from, I'm not sure I understood the second question, I'm sorry. Elon Musk and his money. Look, I mean, one of the sources of democratic backsliding in the United States is this unbelievable gap between this small group of very, very wealthy companies and everybody else. I mean, it's not even about rich and poor anymore, a stratified society. It's about the power of a very, very small group of people. I think probably rightly called oligarchs. I mean, the word oligarch is important because it means something very specific. It came out of the Russian context, and it means people whose money is their own, but is also dependent on access to state resources. And these companies are increasingly, Musk is actually the primary example of somebody who is seeking to use the resources of the American state to make money for himself. And so he has contracts with the Pentagon, he has all kinds of other contracts. He used his term at the head of DOGE, this actually failed initiative to control government spending, completely disastrously failed. He used that moment to stop government investigation and regulation of his companies and possibly to increase his own country. I mean, that was the most egregious example of kind of oligarchic state capture we've ever had. And interestingly, it backfired partly because of demonstrations that were focused on Tesla. So actually there was Musk's wealth in various ways is dependent on his sale of electronic cars. The market for people the audience for electronic cars, the consumers, people who buy them, were people who were angry about his government role, and so therefore he stepped back from it. Although, I would also add again that the role was a failure. There's no evidence that they saved any money. A lot of what they did was destructive in a way that it cost the state money. So, but the point is that you have a group of people who have access somehow now to the state and who've understood that that they can play a role because the nature of their businesses is not, these aren't even oil drillers or manufacturers. These are people who are who decide what kind of information is available to ordinary people and who therefore have an enormous impact on public debate, and therefore they can have an impact on the way democracy works. And let me have a little aside about this argument about free speech, which is also relevant to the question of your elections. Free speech is something that the American right, and it's now been adapted by the right in other places, likes to talk about, the fear that regulation somehow equals censorship. When you use social media, when you use whichever form of it you use, except there are one or two forms that don't have algorithms, but if you put, a post on X, on Twitter, you had the impression that you are speaking freely, right? You put down your post and people react to it, and maybe you have a conversation with them, or maybe you don't, and that feels like a real conversation. Actually, who sees your post? You know, how far it spreads? You know, how many of the reactions, you know, are therefore available to you? All of this is is determined by engineers in Silicon Valley who make decisions for their own commercial, and maybe in the case of Musk, political reasons, decide how far your post is going to go, and who's going to see it. And so it is not free, it's manipulated. And it's really important, you know, at some point for, you know, it is my hope that the one organization on the planet that is capable of regulating not speech, but the algorithmic manipulation of speech, the one organization that can do it might be the European Union. And one of the reasons why people like Musk back anti-European political parties and movements in Europe is they want to undermine the European Union and they want to prevent it from regulating them. I mean, that's another sort of really important dynamic. So yes, I mean, the power of this particular group of oligarchs, their power in the US, and the power that they would like to have in Europe to be, you know, is something that we should all be aware of, and we need to be able to resist. And the only form of resistance is going to be collective. I mean, either it's European or it probably doesn't exist. I mean, it's very hard to imagine one country, especially a smaller country, being able to legislate, you know, somehow against it. And the European, the Digital Securities Act, the European law that's designed to do this is mostly focused on transparency, so making the algorithms more transparent, as well as, you know, law-abiding. You know, what people do online should be subject to the same legal system as people offline, and that's also relevant, by the way, to the question of your election. I mean, if it's illegal in real life, then it's also illegal on TikTok, and so. Anyway, you're right to point to the power of this particular group of tech leaders, because it is probably over time incompatible with democracy. I mean, it's going to be really an American problem to solve, but Europeans need to be aware of it and need to think about how it can be mitigated here.
Have you ever met Elon Musk or Thiel?
No, I haven't met
guys?
Several times.
Okay, so how much is, I mean, the more exotic aspects of these technobrats? I mean, are they real about wanting to live forever through cryogenics or storing food in the basement? Or is it just, you know, urban folklore media hype? I mean, do you think they are real? I mean, they put money in it.
I don't know. I mean, maybe they're real about wanting to live forever, but it seems pretty unlikely that they're going to succeed. So.
Oh, okay. Fair point. I realize we discriminate people from balconies. Oh, okay. So you come from the balcony and you have a question.
I'm not the representative of the balcony, but
you have a question. Okay, so 1, 2, and 3 over here. So you start, the gentleman, and then.
Thank you so much. So I loved it specifically when you said that behind Ukrainian resilience, one very specific thing is this grassroots organization. Yeah, there are many other things probably, but there is this. And I wonder if you can give us, for Romania this time, 1, possibly 2, such sources of resilience. You know, it's sometimes difficult to evaluate ourselves with an outside eye. Thank you.
Can you briefly introduce yourself?
I'm sorry?
Introduce yourself very briefly.
I'm sorry. This is Diana Voicu, Inițiativa România, grassroots civic organization.
Okay.
Civil society.
Over here, please.
My question is regarding the autocracies, and I was wondering, and I was wondering if we can ask people with democratical views, can we speak about a common guilt for the outspread of autocracies, as in the terms of Karl Jaspers once spoke about common guilt of the Germans?
Interesting connection. responsibility for people in the collective responsibility for the peoples if the regime slides to autocracy. So very obviously, you mean like are Russians responsible for the what? What was the question? Please.
People with democratical views, if we held a responsibility for the actions like the invasion of Ukraine by Russia because we weren't aware of the fact that Putin was an autocrat.
Us in the West.
Yes.
Okay. Democratic, yeah, the West, the collective West. You know, collectivism.
Thank you. My name is Marius Diaconu. I'm a lecturer at the Faculty of History, University of Bucharest. So, Mr. Ionita asked at some point what went wrong. My question is, and focused on Central and Eastern European context, if we focus too much on civil society, but we forgot about the return of uncivil society, the term described by Stephen Kotkin, because we see the signs, institutional privileges, internal dysfunction, moral and economic decay, and if the uncivil society is here to stay, and they strike back, to use a Star Wars term, what kind of return do we expect as Central Eastern Europeans? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's take them in turn to the extent possible.
Somehow the acoustics in this room are very bad, and I don't hear your questions very clearly. So I apologize if I'm not. I hear every third word somehow. The question about, examples of grassroots activity. The Ukrainian examples come from, there are local organizations of news organizations, for example. There are quite a lot of locally based groups who have sought to provide local information. Actually, that's something that's happening in the U.S. as well. If the national newspapers system has collapsed, and if you don't have information locally, people are looking for other ways of organizing. Organizing examinations of the government, other ways of putting together. Sometimes starting even literally with newsletters that have been sent around to local people. Some of these they develop eventually into news organizations and news gathering through contribution. That's a kind of example of a grassroots activity that is useful to people. Again, sometimes real information about your region or what's going on locally. This is information that people are willing to pay something for, and they're willing to work on voluntarily, and they're willing to help organize. It's an example of something that you could do. Do the democracies have some responsibility for the invasion of Ukraine? Yeah. The refusal after 2014 to acknowledge the nature of the Russian regime. Sometimes this was for economic reasons. People had big investments in Russia. Sometimes it was political. There was, the idea that Russia was a physical threat to Europeans was something that required such an enormous change in behavior and such an enormous investment in defense and such a different way of thinking that a lot of political leaders, Germans get blamed a lot, but actually it's not only the Germans, it's the French, everybody, the British, a lot of the, there was a kind of failure of the imagination and a failure of will. People didn't want to accept that something as fundamental as European safety was challenged, and they resisted doing that. And there were multiple warnings, and actually even in the weeks coming up to the invasion, there were multiple warnings from the United States, which had information about the upcoming invasion. And yet even then there was still a lot of resistance to acknowledging the reality and providing weapons to Ukraine. I was actually on a German television program. I think it was maybe it was in January. I don't remember it was somehow in the month or two before the February invasion in 2022. the topic of the program was, should Germany provide weapons to Ukraine? And I was arguing that yes, they should. That you know, if an invasion was imminent, one of the ways you could deter an invasion would be to arm Ukraine. And there, I don't remember who was on the panel, but there were 3 or 4 other German politicians. They were all against it. They were all arguing about why it was a bad idea. And in retrospect, it was crazy. I mean, why didn't we arm Ukraine and help them defeat the Russians? And why, you know, imagine if the war had been, we'd been able to end the war in a year. And actually, they came pretty close. You know, even with what little they had, you know, there was this extraordinary resistance of Kiev, and there was, in the autumn of that year, there were a lot of territory was taken back. I mean, we would have saved ourselves a lot of time and money in retrospect if we'd ended the war before it dragged on for this long. And so, yeah, I think absolutely the Western leaders and Western public who were, you know, who, as I said, didn't want to accept that this challenge was real, are partly responsible for it. Too much focus on civil society. I'm never quite, you know, civil society is a word that has different definitions depending on what you mean. I mean, you know, civil society is you know, civil society is like a, you know, it can be a private school, you know, people organizing in a community to build a school, or civil society can be, you know, a group of people organizing to better run a local market. I mean, civil society doesn't necessarily have to be political. And, you know, sometimes the most effective and long-standing forms of civil society aren't especially political. And they're the ones that, you know, there's a lot of value in people meeting one another and deciding to do something together. You know, I don't know, renovate a local building or a church, or you know, organizing a local, you know, spring festival or something like that. I mean, there's a lot of value in that, even for democracy, because when people meet together and they organize things together, then they learn how to, you know, resolve arguments. I mean, I mean, many of you will know this. There's a very famous essay about the United States written in the 19th century by the French writer Alexis de Tocqueville, and this is one of the things that he is most interested in about the United States. He's trying to understand why American democracy seems to work. And the thing he focuses on is what he calls civil society, but it means like church groups and people building, you know, funeral societies and other kinds of organizations, you know, and he argues that this is the foundation of American democracy, is these groups, these organizations, because that's how people learn to interact and do things as a group, even if they're not explicitly political. I mean, I suppose there is an argument that, you know, there's a danger in, I mean, this now goes down a very technical road. You know, maybe there was too much funding for civil society as opposed to politics itself. You know, that you can't really have democracy unless you have, you know, well-funded political parties that have roots in the society, and unless you have elections that are functional, and unless your courts are functional. And so funding outside groups is very good and useful, but actually the institutions of the state also have to work. And so there's an argument that maybe not enough of that was thought about, you know, in the 90s and 2000s. But then you get into kind of hair splitting, and we'd have to go and have an argument about who was funding what and when, and we don't want to do that right now. It's done very well in your paper, actually.
Thank you very much.
You talk about civil society funding, who was doing it, what were the good things and bad things, and so on.
With a glorious conclusion, I suggest we finish the debate because, yeah, very well there. And now we have to focus on the books now. So we move to the last moment of the meeting today, which is in the lobby. And as orderly as possible, I suggest we all move there, where will be book signing. We stay for but we like people.
Excellent, thank you. Don't forget your
Nicoleta, vino și
in 1989, yeah. You know, the police wall was free.
Here there are some pictures from 1989.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. How shall I sign it? Just make sure I sign it. This is for LVO.